Okay, so I'm doing a live stream podcast solely on the NHL this evening, and there's a fair bit to talk about. There are some teams that are struggling that weren't expected to struggle as much as they have, and there are some teams playing above what was expected at the beginning of the season. Now, obviously, I'm not wearing an NHL jersey, but uh, I'm wearing my local football, my football team here in the UK that I support. But the interesting thing is, there's a lot of talk about the Maple Leafs and their struggles and the issues within that organisation. Now, I've been watching a few bits like Tim and Sid and TSN on YouTube and catching up with it. And I've been catching up with the NHL the last couple of weeks because obviously I recently moved, so I haven't had access to the internet and I haven't been able to watch as many games as I would like. Now, the issues with the Maple Leafs are that they've overpaid players, they're being outworked, and their GM is completely out of his depth, and that's my personal opinion. Now, the issue they face is they've won less than half their games. They've only won 9 games out of 20, 21 games, and we're a quarter way through the season. They're not in a playoff place, which is something that they've had issues with anyway. They get to the first round and then fail. They haven't taken that next step. Defensively, they're a shambles. They cannot defend, and obviously they've got issues with the backup goaltender and who's going to be backing up Anderson on a regular, frequent basis. It's interesting because Carl Dubas obviously has been groomed to replace Lou Lamoriello. Lou Lamoriello has moved to the Islanders, and look how the Islanders are doing. There are some of all their parts, but they're a harder working team than the Leafs. They have grit, they have determination, they have depth. The Leafs get bullied. They don't physically overpower teams. They try and outskill them. And yes, they've got some really good skilled players. They're very top heavy in their attacking talent. But if you look at the issues the Leafs face, there isn't much depth there. And the issue is, I think they're going to overplay Anderson in goal. The contract negotiations with Nylander, Marner, and Matthews, I think they've overpaid. The John Tavares trade, where they nabbed him from the Islanders, and well, not really a trade, but they signed him as a free agent. They offered him more money. That hasn't necessarily worked as well as it could have. The media and the fan base are very on the team. So there's no place to hide with that organisation. There's rumours that Mike Babcock might be on the way out and might be getting sacked, which I think is a mistake because he's one of the best coaches in the league. But Carl Dubas is a very, very young GM. He's only, I think, a year or so older than me, so he's not very old. There are players on that roster that are older than him. And I don't know what's going on with the Maple Leafs, but the Toronto media get really, on top of the team. Obviously, the team haven't had much playoff success in recent years. They haven't managed to get out the first round when they've got back to the playoffs, and the pressure is there. And I think some players are underperforming for how much they're paid. They're overpaying players. They're going to be in cap hell soon, and I think the salary cap being lower than expected has caused some issues. And there are other teams that I will discuss that have cap issues as well. But defensively, there is no there's no stay-at-home defenseman there. There is no veteran defenseman there. They're playing run and gun. It doesn't work. They are a young team in general speak. So if you look at it generally, they are quite a young core of leadership. They've lost some grit in Matt Martin and Nazem Kadri and Komarov all leaving in the last couple of seasons. So they've lost that sandpaper. And I think, you got to look at it. And yeah, you may not be an NHL fan, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can't dip in and have a look at it and watch a game here or there and learn about what the NHL is and what a great sport ice hockey is. I think it's a really entertaining sport. I think, but it's not for everyone. I mean, the NHL is my favorite league. Ice hockey is my favorite sport, but I also like rugby league and rugby union as well. But I think I'm going to devote some time to the NHL this evening because yesterday's live stream we bounced around a lot of questions on a lot of sports, and people ask me how easy it is for me to be such a sports fan. It's quite easy, but I thought I'd focus on this because I think there are other teams that I'm going to discuss, but the Maple Leafs is obviously in the Canadian media. It's intense. There are other Canadian teams. Obviously, there's 6 other Canadian teams with their own issues, and I'll go through each and every one of them really if you want. But the Maple Leafs, they started brightly. They can score goals. They can't defend. So you think of the Maple Leafs like Manchester United in the English Premier League, one of the biggest fan bases. Historical team, lots of record-breaking, trophies. Second most successful team in NHL history after the Montreal Canadiens, but they haven't really had a dominant spell for a long time. They've not won the Stanley Cup since '67, so there's been a lengthy period of time with no success. And I think the best way to describe it is they're very similar to like Liverpool, Manchester United, where they have been successful in the past and been a very dominant team and won lots of titles and division titles and conference titles, lots of great playoff history. But in recent years, they haven't had that. They've had some poor ownership in their time. They have a very expectant fan base who are very impatient. The media in Toronto, very similar to the media here in the UK, very centralised in Toronto. It's a lot of pressure on these players, a lot of media spotlight. When a player has a bad game, they really out them. A few years ago, the team were absolutely terrible. Couldn't do anything. They completely nosedive. And yes, they got Austin Matthews in the draft, and they basically were a mess for a while. Yes, the team has massively improved from where they were in 2015, 2016, and they have really turned it around. But the team is young, and doesn't actually have the depth they need. They don't have the physicality that they need, and they are being outworked by teams. There's a work ethic issue. There's clearly a coaching issue with how the GM Carl Dubas wants to construct the team and how Mike Babcock wants to have the team play. I think you look at how successful Mike Babcock has been with the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim and the Detroit Red Wings in his coaching career. He's got a great coaching CV. He's been coaching in the NHL for over 20 years. He's won a lot of games. He's one of the most successful coaches in the modern era. Will I be doing a video about the GB Lions Rugby League tour? Well, I've mentioned it. I haven't watched any of the games, but I've seen the results. I've seen some highlights. Again, question marks about how that team was put together, and the fact that they've been whitewashed on the tour is embarrassing. And losing to PNG, I mean, Papua New Guinea are a good side, and I will mention this. And when they play at home, it is very difficult for away teams to defeat them. They have a home crowd advantage. They have the conditions as well that they're used to. But the way that GB were ahead at halftime, 10 points to 6, and then they were blitzed at the beginning of the second half with 3 really basically copycat tries. All 3 of the tries were basically very, very similar in how they were scored down the left-hand side. The right-hand side defence was absolutely hopeless. And you've got to ask the questions of Wayne Bennett and the fact that basically Australian-born players who may have a relative who is British, be it a parent, a grandparent, anything like that, were selected over British-born and raised and trained players. That's some question marks there. I mean, that's the selection rules of International Rugby League. They are a bit of a joke, in my view. The homegrown talent wasn't really selected. The overseas talent that has a tenuous link to the UK were selected. That's a problem. That's an issue that I think rugby league as a sport needs to address. But if I go back to the NHL, the Maple Leafs, there is a lot of debate right now about obviously the Maple Leafs. The Toronto media is well ripping the team to pieces. Their form is worrying for the amount of talent they have, but they're very top end heavy. I will possibly do a video on the GB Lions tour, and we could look at the advanced stats, and we can look at the issues that the team has faced and who played well, who didn't play well, where games were won and lost. But I think there's a lot more issues at play within that particular sport, both in Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands, and in Europe as well, in the Super League-based structure. There's a lot of issues, and money's a big problem. Looking back at the NHL, we'll touch on the Maple Leafs. If there's any questions on the Carl Dubas, Mike Babcock, will Mike Babcock still be coach at the Maple Leafs long term? Because there are rumours that he's on the way out. There's a rumour of a rift between him and Carl Dubas when it comes to how the team is put together, the style of play that they want to play. I don't think the Maple Leafs play a very balanced play. It seems to be all attack and no physicality, no pushback in defence, very porous defence. And you can't win without defending. if your goals for and against, it's not good. There's a lot of sports teams which play a very attacking style, and it does pay off. But when you start conceding goals and conceding points more than you're scoring, you're not very likely to take that next step and win silverware. The Minnesota Wild is another team which is struggling at the moment. Their issues are that they've got a very aged core. They're a slower team. I think they've also had their struggles in getting out the first round of the playoffs. They are really struggling. They have not in a good place. They're in a very tough division as it is in the Central, which is a cutthroat division. Any one of the 7 teams is a playoff team. As we've seen in recent years, several Stanley Cup winners have come from that division, and several Stanley Cup contenders are in that division. You can look at the Minnesota Wild and the struggles they are facing. They are throwing leads away. They're having issues with defense, and their key leadership players are older, and the league is getting younger and faster. Yes, they're a physical, solid, hard-working team. They're not playing badly as necessarily. They're just not getting the results that are needed for them to get out of the situation they're in. And if teams like Chicago, who are also struggling at the moment, are actually starting to turn their form around, they can really get detached from the rest of the division, the wildcard spaces and the playoff places very, very quickly. Nashville have started to hit the skids as well. Their defense has completely collapsed. Their goaltending has just gone down the toilet. So Pekka Rinne had a nightmare against Chicago. Some really sloppy goals that he conceded that you would expect a goaltender who's been to a Stanley Cup final and been one of the best goaltenders in the last decade should have had. But the defense all over the place, lack of organisation. And I think that the issue with the Nashville Predators is they are built to win now. That there is no it's a win now kind of roster. They have some exceptionally talented players within that roster and that lineup. Some really exceptionally talented players. They've got one of the best defense scores on paper, so to speak. Yet they're conceding nearly double-figure goals. In the last couple of weeks, they've conceded a stupid amount of goals, and they're not scoring enough going the other way. So there's a goal scoring issue, if that's confidence or players not being fully fit, or lacking that bit of confidence under a bit of pressure. But defensively, they are just it's a sieve. I've not seen a Nashville team defend that badly ever. They've always been a defensively solid, balanced team, but the defense for the Nashville Predators has gone down the toilet. The LA Kings, Ilya Kovalchuk looks like he's on the way out. It looks like that there is going to be some kind of trade or buyout of his contract, and it was very surprising when they re-signed him, considering his age, how long he's been out the NHL and the KHL, the fact the league is getting younger and faster. LA are a team in crisis. They were a team that were built to win now, and they haven't refreshed the lineup enough. There's too many older players there that have lost too much pace in a league that is getting younger and faster. Still just as physical. There's still fights and line brawls, but the game is getting faster, and the team that LA have, much like Minnesota, older, slower, more methodical. And the Ilya Kovalchuk situation, it looks like he is on the way out of Staples Center. This Blackburn kit's this kit's got this in 2006, so it's 13 years old. Had it a long time. It's well loved, as you can see, bits of it falling off, but it's another birthday present from 13 years ago when I was a fair bit younger. Movember, I'm sort of doing Movember. It's a complicated thing, but yes, I've decided to do the Freddie Mercury and grow my mustache. Obviously raising awareness about men's health of all kinds, be it mental health or cancer or male-specific diseases. A fair bit has happened health-wise for me, but we'll go on from that. Of course, I'm getting questions of non-NHL related questions. I'm obviously want to keep it obviously a bit more NHL related, but the Wayne Bennett thing, I can definitely do a video on that. I think I've mentioned it in previous live streams, the concerns that I've had about the GB Lions tour from looking at the results and catching what highlights I can on the internet. I've seen the first few minutes of the second half against PNG, and the 3 quick-fire tries were all the same style of play down the PNG, uh, uh, PNG left, GB defensive right. They were all pretty much text copycat tries from the same style of play, the same kind of attack, and the defense just couldn't cope with it. But the Wayne Bennett thing, we can definitely discuss that in a separate video. And should he still be the England coach, and should he still be the GB Lions coach? Because obviously there's going to be more tours planned. Was it a mistake to go with an Australian to coach a British side? I wouldn't think so. But I think we'll see what happens. On the rugby league kind of stuff and the other sports, other live streams can cover that, and other videos that I'll do will cover that. But we can definitely discuss Wayne Bennett. We can just definitely discuss that on other videos. Should they do outdoor games in Texas and California? It depends where. Obviously, temperatures are generally higher in Texas and California, even in winter. So you've got to remember the ice surface. Can that be maintained? I'm not an overly massive fan of the outdoor and winter classic kind of games and the heritage classics and things like that. I think it is a pure money grab for the NHL, plain and simple. I think I don't know what it is, but they do play in some amazing stadiums and arenas when they do these outdoor games. But a lot of the fans are so far from the action, and you've got to feel for the players as well, not just the fans, but there have been some outdoor games where the temperatures have been absolutely sub-zero, and that is a player welfare concern and fan welfare concern for me. There have been. I think there is an outdoor game planned in Texas at some point. I think there are some hopefully in the pipeline in California if for those fans who do like the outdoor games. Obviously, there are some teams that haven't had an outdoor game yet. I think Arizona are getting one at some point as well, but. We'll see. The NHL does have games outside of Canada in the US. They have had a European series. They have taken preseason games to China. Last year it was Florida, and Winnipeg went to Finland for 2 games back to back. We've had games in Sweden. We've had preseason. Philadelphia played some preseason games in Switzerland. So the NHL have done that. They have taken preseason and regular season games, predominantly to Europe. Obviously, more European players and fans are watching the NHL now than 25, 30 years ago. So they have taken games to these locations. They've done some this season. And they've met with reasonable positivity. I think the European fan base, appreciates it. A lot of the players now are European, more so percentage-wise than they were 20 years ago. So there's a huge proportion of the players that play in the NHL are from European countries. You just have to look at the percentages. They've been slowly rising year on year, and there's less Canadians and Americans, I think, now playing in the NHL percentage-wise. But the NHL is also a bigger league than what it was in the 90s expansion. So there are more teams, therefore more players. But I think, again, you have to get that right because the face-off times, Europe is 5 to 6 hours, generally speaking, ahead of the East Coast, which means it's 8 to 9 hours ahead of the West Coast. So TV timings are a thing. So face-off times when they play these games. When I was watching the Stanley Cup playoffs in April and May, the games were taking place really late at night over here in Europe. So again, that's a thing that the NHL is very keen on not changing face-off times for the European audience as much. So you sometimes have to stay up into the middle of the night. It's pretty good when a game's like on a Friday night or a Saturday night, and you can get it on European networks. Over here in the UK, it's Premier and Free Sports. Other countries have it on cable TV or satellite TV as well. But the difference between the NHL and other sports leagues is the Premier League, for example, here in the UK and English football. They've changed a lot of kickoff times to suit the US Canadian audience, and that's angered a lot of fans and has annoyed a lot of people, and that isn't going down well with a lot of fans. So the NHL is very careful with what time face-offs take place. Do I see any more British players going to the NHL? Yes, I do. I think the quality level has massively improved, and as long as Great Britain stay in the top tier at the World Championships, that will continue to increase interest and grow the game. Liam Kirk is not the first British player to go over, but I think in the modern era he is it was a big thing. Social media went nuts for it. It was spoken about on US and Canadian media outlets, be it websites or TV. So it became a big thing. He went later in the draft than he was expected to go. So that's a bit of a cheeky pickup by Arizona as well. I think that's a good bit of business by Chaker, the GM of Arizona. I think that was a very, very good piece of drafting by the organization. I think he will play games in the NHL, whether he's a long-term NHL regular, because he's a seventh-round draft pick and they rarely do make it to the NHL. Though Pavel Datsyuk is an example of a guy who was drafted late, went later than expected, and is a future Hall of Famer, I have no doubt, and is a brilliant player who's still playing at the age of 41 in the KHL. So there is an opportunity. There is obviously a likelihood that he could do it. Many undrafted players have also done quite well in the NHL as well. So it's not unusual or completely unheard of that a late round draft pick does make it to the NHL. But I think his ceiling is probably more AHL level, which is the league below, the affiliate league. But I wouldn't be surprised if he does get some NHL games and has a decent professional career long term. His development at the Peterborough Petes I've been following that. He's been playing really well. His numbers are good, goals and assists. His ice time is good. He seems to have a good chemistry with his teammates in the OHL. So it's looking positive, if I could say that. Do I think the Stanley Cup should be one game instead of 7? No. Hockey's different. You can play back-to-back games. We see it regularly in the NHL regular season. The difference between the NFL is they have such a short regular season. The style of play is different. You cannot. It's how it's done. I like the playoff series that we have in the NHL. It gives both teams an equal opportunity to take it to that game 7. I don't think it's a difficult one. Other sports obviously have the one-off cup finals and one-off semi-finals or a home and away leg, but I think it does work. It's we've always had that kind of playoff format where it's multiple games in a series. In ice hockey, it's never not been that way. No, I'm not watching the game at all. I haven't actually got a TV aerial installed in my TV yet. I'm having some issues with my landlord over the satellite dish on the roof that the previous tenant left, and I haven't got an aerial attachment because I've only got an analog aerial in my flat from when the flat was bought years ago. I've got 2 digital aerial slots, but I've got no cable for it at the moment, and I haven't got a TV license at the moment. So that's something that I'm not gonna tempt fate with. Lots going on. The flat isn't even fully organised yet. There's still, as you can see, stuff all over the place. Haven't got the whiteboard up yet. I've got to figure out how to do videos with the whiteboard and get the little set sorted out. Space is limited where I am. I've heard that England are winning, so that's the important thing. But I'm getting a bit bored with football at the moment. I think there's a lot of negative stories coming out about football all the time, and I'd rather focus on sports that have a more positive kind of vibe with me at the moment. I think, and there are some football videos I could do, or soccer videos if you're North American. But at the moment, I'm sticking to the NHL live stream tonight because it's a sport that I haven't done enough videos on lately, which I should do more. And it's my favorite league and my favorite sport. So I'm doing it a disservice by not talking about it as much as I would want. I feel that some of my best videos on the channel are NHL related, so I want to focus a little bit on the NHL. I do a hockey vlog. Well, we're trying tonight, and it's not going very well. I don't want to keep starting up new channels all the time. I think that would not really benefit. That would confuse things. I like doing what I do with the multiple sport channel. But tonight we're going to try and focus on the NHL as much as possible. There are some other teams that I like to talk about. The resurgence of Arizona, they are in a very strong playoff position. We've got teams like San Jose that have had a really bad start to the season and now recovering. Edmonton with McDavid and Draisaitl scoring stupid amounts of points, and the pace they're on for points could be record breaking. I don't think it is sustainable for the whole 82 game schedule, but Edmonton have really turned things around this season. Whether that is sustainable long term is another thing. That's an organisation that's had a very rough decade or so since they last reached the Stanley Cup final. Edmonton as a team is an interesting. The Edmonton Oilers is an interesting organisation that I think there's a lot of negativity. There's been a lot of negativity around for a very, very long time, and this season that negativity seems to have disappeared out the window. Whether it's a happy organisation behind the scenes, we'll wait and see. There's been a GM change, coaching change, and the players seem to have responded. Henrik Lundqvist still playing, yes. A good friend of mine is a Rangers fan, and it is interesting that Henrik Lundqvist is still playing, but at the same time, while he's in the twilight of his career, I still think he has a lot to give to the sport. I think he's going to be an ambassador or work with the Rangers organisation post retirement. I think he's not I think he's going to still give back to the sport when he retires. He has. I think he does deserve a Stanley Cup. I think he's one of the best goaltenders not to win the Stanley Cup in their career at this point. But I don't see the Rangers being a Stanley Cup team for a while. Yeah, I think when they fell out the playoffs, they crashed badly. They have a decent lineup, but I think they need to make a few more changes. But Henrik Lundqvist is an amazing goaltender, but I think his numbers are starting to slow down. When a goalie really loses it, it goes quickly. I think he might have a season or two left. But some goalies have played into their 40s, so anything's possible. He's still got a good couple of seasons in him. And I think when he does decide to retire, I think he's definitely going to be involved in some kind of ambassador role or head office role with the Rangers going forward. I think he's going to have a career, post-playing career in the NHL in some way, shape or form, whether it's actually with NHL head office or in the front office at the Rangers. The Rangers are a team, though, that while they're one of the original six, they're the least successful of the original six, but they've got one of the biggest fan bases and best attendances, and they play in New York, so the media spotlight on that team as well is intense, much like Toronto. So it's an interesting organisation, is the Rangers, considering that their near neighbours, the Islanders, struggle with attendance, yet look what they are in the league. What about the NBA? I'm not a big fan of basketball. I didn't enjoy playing it. I will watch the occasional game, absolutely. But I think for me, basketball is not a sport that I enjoy. I don't mind watching it, but it's not a sport that I'm religiously involved in. I don't, watch it intensely. It's a sport that, while it has its merits, it's not a sport that's for me in a sense. I have done videos on the NBA, and there are some issues within the NBA that are worth discussing, and then there's some interesting stories about the NBA that are worth doing historical videos on. Absolutely, I've done a few on them, and I could possibly do more. But at the same time, it's not a sport that I have a vested interest in. It's not a sport that I enjoy playing at school. It's not a sport that I really religiously watch. I've watched games, obviously, for the channel's benefit, and I will happily watch basketball at the Olympics, or if I can catch a game, I will. And I do think the NBA is a very successful league for a reason. It's a very profitable league for a reason. They've got the reason why the NBA exists, though, is because of the NHL. The hockey owners wanted to use their buildings and make more money, and the NBA and the NHL are interestingly linked. The NBA basketball was invented by a Canadian, and obviously Canada is the home of ice hockey as well. So the NBA and the NHL are interestingly linked with their history. But it's an interesting one. It's an interesting question. Back to the NHL and the teams that I want to talk about. There are some teams that are surprising, as I say. The Florida Panthers have picked it up. They are in a playoff place. Arizona are in a playoff place. The Islanders are possibly going to go for a President's Trophy, it looks like. The turnaround with the Islanders in the last couple of years has been outstanding. Lou Lamoriello and Barry Trotz have worked miracles since they were brought in the GM and coaching capacities. And you can definitely see the turnaround in that organisation. They've got a new arena being built. The Islanders have had struggles from the 90s onwards. They've really struggled with a lot of things, attendance being one, playoff success or lack of it, not really having that franchise player. They sort of had it in Tavares. He's gone. The team have got better. They've got a good work ethic. They play with some good energy. And, They've won a lot of games this season. They have a very, very terrifying record, and I can see them possibly getting the President's Trophy. Whether that leads to playoff success is another thing. I think they have to transfer this regular season form they've got into the playoffs and make a playoff run. Of course, the early 80s was the Islanders' era, winning 4 Stanley Cups, but they haven't won a Stanley Cup since. So they've had a long, lengthy period without success. And they are a franchise due some success, I honestly believe. I think they've definitely got the right pieces in place to be a successful team. And they've got pieces now that they didn't have for the last 20, 30 years. They've got some sort of goaltending at last. They've really got a good team work ethic. They seem to have a very positive outlook at the moment, where the organisation has been so badly run for so long. They suddenly have some stability, and with stability, look what happens. Teams that are struggling and are not performing as well, it's really, really stark how some teams are really underperforming and some teams are really overperforming. I'm a Jets fan. The defence core is not the strongest in the NHL. I think the Bufflin situation and the salary cap being lower than what was anticipated this time last year has actually affected how that defence core is put together, but the team is still winning. And that's something and the team is improving. And the Central Division for me, looking at the teams in it, the quality of players in it, and the fact that there's one less team in it means it's actually, I think, the hardest division in the NHL to regularly get into playoffs, because I think all the teams in that division are playoff teams. The fact that the Minnesota Wild look dead and buried and look like an emergency rebuild, and the Chicago Blackhawks have declined as a team in the last couple of years because, well, they've got an aged core and they're sort of in a rebuild themselves. But I look at it and I look at the teams and how they're playing. The Central Division is a scary division. Obviously, in a couple of years' time, we have Seattle joining the league, and that's going to make things very, very interesting with the new expansion draft. And moving Arizona, who are a team that are resurgent themselves, that look like a playoff team and look like they could do something this year. That's a franchise that's not had stability for a long time. Suddenly getting stability, the coaching's paying off. Again, good work ethic, hard-working team, defensively sound, high energy team, young team with some veterans. Look what they are. Pacific is one of the weaker divisions, and it's starting to look like there's a couple of teams in that are going to run away with it. So Edmonton and Arizona, the rest of the teams look decidedly weaker. But it's going to be interesting when Seattle joins the league, when Arizona moves over to the Central, balances out the conferences, balances out the divisions. Could there be a change in how many divisions there are? There are debates about changing the schedule to 84 games, 8 divisions, changing how the playoff format works. So that's going to be interesting in a couple of years' time. But at the moment, we're going to stick with the 2-conference 4-division system. But it's an interesting one. But LA, they are a team in crisis. They're not doing well. And Anaheim completely fallen off the map. They're crashing. Vancouver have gone on a bit of a wobble, losing streak after a very strong start. Calgary are in a mess. So the Pacific is a division that started really brightly this season. Vegas are having a bit of a wobble, and they're not playing as well as they have in the previous 2 seasons. Has that shine of Vegas sort of rubbed off now a little bit, and it's looking like the team they were meant to be when they were put together? That's an interesting question to look at. On the other side of things, Tampa, I think they're still feeling the effects of being swept in the first round in the playoffs last year. They haven't really got into their stride at all, and they're lagging a bit. You look at, as I say, Toronto, which is what we started the live stream on. The issues with Toronto are laid bare because the media are so intense in that market that they are on so much scrutiny and so much pressure. I do think they've definitely overpaid players to be there. The Nylander situation a couple of years ago when he dragged out his contract negotiations, the Marner contract, the Matthews and Tavares, they are paid a lot of money. These are some of the top paid players in the league. They haven't won a playoff round as a group. They've had a lack of playoff success for a long time as an organisation. And Mike Babcock, who's one of the best coaches in the league at this current time, one of the most successful coaches in the league, could he be on the way out? And if you get rid of Mike Babcock, who do you get in to replace him? Is a coaching changing Is coach change really needed? Is that a necessary evil to have? Because that's going to clearly disrupt the chemistry in the dressing room. Is Carl Dubas the right guy to be GM, considering that some of the players in that organisation are older than him? And have they got the goaltending roster right? Because Freddie Anderson, while he's a solid goaltender, one of the best in the league, he's not getting the help he needs. They're constantly rotating the backups. Hutchinson's been thrown under the bus, which I think is unfair. He's been bounced around the league. His confidence is clearly that's shot. It's an interesting one on where that team is. But the market they play in, the media intensity, the media scrutiny, the fan base. Oh God, the fan base. And you go to other teams in Canada and you look at them and you look at Vancouver. Not expected to be where they are league wise. They are starting to fall back. Calgary, they haven't recovered, it seems, from their first round defeat and first round exit in the playoffs last season. Edmonton, resurgence. They are a very bipolar team. They're either really good or really bad. But for the most part, they've drafted some good draft picks and not developed players, and players have really had issues with that organisations, and players have gone, I want out. You look at Winnipeg, issues because of the salary cap and dragging out the RFAs of Connor and Line 8. That's an issue. I think the Buffalo issue was badly handled in the sense that it should have been sorted out at the end of the season. That was put on long-term injured reserve. They could have kept Sherratt. They could have kept Myers. Truba was going to go. That was an issue that was ongoing for quite some time and wasn't well handled either by player or team. So Cheveldayoff is under a bit of pressure. Paul Maurice, though, again, one of the most experienced, successful coaches in the league for wins. He's in the top 10, top 15. Pretty solid coach. But I think that organisation for so long when it was in Atlanta, when it was first in Winnipeg, was so bad that three out of their 4 playoff appearances have come since 2015. So that's an organisation that's on the up. You again go to Ottawa. That's an organisation which is in chaos, although it's sort of stabilised, but they're not a very good team in the sense that compared to the rest of the NHL, that's not a good roster, but they're getting wins. They're sort of staying competitive, but they're not going to be a playoff team for quite some time. Montreal, they've really turned things around. They've had a bit of a barren spell the last couple of years where they've not made the playoffs. They haven't got that out-and-out star player, but again, hard-working, good work ethic. They've made some good trades. There's a few bad contracts on that team, but the players that are there are buying into the systems in place, and it's paying off. Toronto, it's all gone a bit wrong because they've put a lot of capital and investment into this really young leadership core. And is the pressure building on them? There's been some off-ice incidents with some of the players. It's an interesting one. But the NHL as a whole, I think, is the only good teams in Canada is the Canucks and Oilers. I'm a Jets fan, so I'm going to be slightly biased in who I want to win every game. But I say this: you're not going to win every game. You're not going to win every playoff series. You're not going to win a Stanley Cup every year. A lot of fans in some markets I think every year is going to be their year. Some fan bases have a very, very expectant. And when you've got a team like Toronto that hasn't won for 52 years the Stanley Cup and has had a lengthy spell outside the playoffs and not having a lot of playoff success, and they're not getting out the first round, and with a fan base that expects every year, it is a problem. But you look at the Canadian teams, there's only a handful I can think of that are going to be contending in the playoffs as it currently stands. There are teams on paper that are really good. That's why I'm really surprised with Calgary. I'm really surprised with Toronto and how they are struggling. Vancouver had a great start of the season. They've gone back to reality. Winnipeg are building into the season. We seem to start slowly every season, yet we still on paper, the Flames are a brilliant team. They've got a really good roster. They've got some young talent. They've got some senior veterans who are also gnarly. They've got decent goaltending. For some reason, the confidence is gone. Johnny Gaudreau is not playing Johnny Gaudreau hockey. He's not happy. He's clearly frustrated. The loss to Arizona sums up that frustration. They were shut out. There was that line brawl towards the end. They were outplayed, outthought. There is clearly some kind of issue with confidence within that organisation, and I think the playoffs last year has had a massive impact on that team. And there is clearly some issues with the Flames. But the issue with the Flames, I think, is they haven't had that solid goaltending since Kiprasov. They haven't had that out-and-out goalie who can win you a playoff series. And I think really he's a solid goalie. I think Cam Talbot's a good pickup. But I think there are some issues with confidence. And is Bill Peters the right guy to be coach? I think he did some great things last year in the regular season. They were a very solid side last year. The playoffs, it fell apart. And I don't know what the Flames could do to change that, whether it's trade a player out, bring some fresh faces in. I don't think a coaching change is the right way to go about it, personally. I think they've got the right coach in place, but I think there are issues within that dressing room that need addressing. I think it is confidence. And it could be the leadership call. It could be make some changes via trade or waiver wire, but something isn't clicking there. And it's very similar in Toronto. It's very similar in Tampa as well. Teams that failed to get out the first round last year, that have really good rosters on paper, some really talented players, aren't performing to the level that is expected. And the Flames should be better than what they are. They should be dominating the Pacific Division, and they're not. It seems the Oilers have taken the mantle of the Flames as the best team in Alberta right now and are taking that next step. They've figured out their issues. They've made coaching changes. They've made GM changes. They've made a couple of roster changes that have had a positive impact on the team, and they're taking that next step, whereas Calgary have taken a step back. And I don't understand. I don't know how you fix that. Can the Oilers sustain their momentum? Let's hope they can, because the NHL is at its best when all the Canadian teams are playing well. And I think at the moment, there's a divide between the teams that are and aren't. There's a big, clear divide. There's only a couple of Canadian teams that I think could constantly be playoff teams at least and keep being playoff regulars. And at the moment, what I'm seeing is teams that are very hit and miss, not consistent enough, and not taking that next step. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I think at the moment the Canadian teams are in flux, and that does, I think, have a negative impact on the various things. And you look at Hockey Night in Canada and what's happened with Don Cherry and things like that. I think there's a lot going on in Canadian hockey right now. I think we could do what the Jets do, maybe what we aren't playing the way we. But you look, we said that's a good coverage. Last year there was a lot of discussion about the Edmonton Oilers and the atmosphere in that organisation and the negativity around that organisation. The Edmonton Oilers, while they're having a great start to this season, they made the playoffs a couple of years ago. For the most part, for a long period of time, it's been a very negative atmosphere. There's been a lot of rumours coming out about drug misuse, issues within the locker room, bad management, lack of direction. They seem to have fixed that. But this is an organisation where they regularly draft really well, and then the young talent doesn't want to stay around. The only three players that really have stuck it out in Edmonton are Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Leon Draisaitl, and Connor McDavid. And that is their leadership call. Those are their if one of those three players goes down, injured, that does affect the middle. Now, they're playing Draisaitl alongside McDavid, and that seems to be working this season, but in reality, you want him as your second-line centre, or rotate those two as your first and second-line centres on a rotation. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, you want as your third-line centre, in preferably, possibly second-line, but if one of those three gets injured, that's the spine of the team. That's the creativity of the team. That's where your points come from. That's where your goals come from. If one of those three gets injured, especially McDavid or Draisaitl, then you have problems. Nugent-Hopkins, if he gets injured, it will affect the team somewhat in balance, but at the same time, he stuck it out when it was really, really bad at Edmonton, really bad. The fact that as a group, they've only had one playoff appearance with that call is shambolic, to be honest. They've been so poor for so long that now that they're having this really great start to the season, can they keep that momentum going? And then can they transfer that, should they get to the playoffs, deep into a playoff run? Because they have the talent and they have the best two or three of the best players in the league that I've just named. They've had one playoff appearance as a group, and this is some talent that shouldn't only have one playoff appearance to their name. They should have consistent playoff appearances and good playoff numbers. They've had one playoff run as a group, as a core, and that's something that just isn't right. That should not be acceptable with the talent they have there, and that comes down to coaching, GM, how atmosphere, culture, and I think we'll see what happens. If you look at the US teams though, and the teams that are starting to fall back and struggle, and the teams that have improved, wow, it couldn't be more stark. The Islanders, how they've bounced back under Lou Lamoriello and Barry Trotz, that coaching GM setup, working wonders, absolute wonders, and that team has really turned their fortunes around. But that's a team that's had similar issues that the Oilers have had, with culture, with lack of direction, with poor management, poor ownership, all sorts. Oh yeah, look, if any one of those three players goes down injured or loses form, they are in trouble. Now, Nugent Hopkins is a solid point producer. He's a solid two-way forward who's creative, can score goals, can get points. He can be a first-line centre if necessary, but he's better at second or third line. Draisaitl, in reality, should be a centre, but he's playing on McDavid's wing. That seems to be working at the moment with the roster that they have. How sustainable is that long-term? But if any one of those three players goes down injured for a lengthy period of time, or suspension or illness or whatever it may be, or loses a bit of form, it does affect the team. They don't have anyone else. They are heavily reliant on those three players. And that is a massive, massive concern. Yes, they've got a bit of momentum now, and they seem to have a good direction in coaching and GM now. They've made the changes necessary, but there's been a long period of negativity and lack of direction within this organisation. That's had a massive impact on the fact that some good quality early round draft picks have gone. Now, is Taylor Hall on the way out of New Jersey? That's another question. There's rumours that he wants to go back and Larson go the other way. That's an interesting debate you could have. But Taylor Hall, there's a reason why he's not in Edmonton now. He was not happy there. He was very critical of the organisation. And Edmonton's one of those organisations that there's been a lot of rumours coming out about Edmonton over the years of poor culture, drug misuse, player misbehaviour, and a poor culture in Edmonton for a very long time. Going back to when they were successful in the 80s, there's been a lot of stories coming out of the Edmonton organisation of not a very positive light. So that's something that the organisation needs to figure out. But they've started to go in the right direction, and it'll be interesting to see if they can maintain that in the long run, because that is an organisation with a lack of success for a long period of time. And I think a couple back-to-back playoff appearances will help. It will help build confidence with the players themselves. And when you've got players like McDavid, Draisaitl, and Ryan Nugent-Hopkins not getting playoff appearances, that's a sham. That shouldn't be happening. With that those three talented players not getting into in the playoffs is just a joke. Do I think any one of the Canadian NHL teams can win a Stanley Cup? I think the Jets, if they add a couple of defensemen, definitely can be a threat. I think the Oilers, if they can get some good playoff success and some consistent playoff appearances, could do it in a couple of years. I don't think they have the playoff experience as a group to make that run, although Carolina did it in 2006. So it is doable with a lack of playoff history or regular playoff appearances. But I think Montreal are looking good this season as a solid unit. Some of all their parts, hardworking, good work ethic. The Jets, it seems to be a positive organisation for the most part. This off-season's been a little tricky, but I think the group of players they've got there bought into a philosophy. And it seems to be a very positive organisation in the sense that the fans, even when the team aren't playing well, still turn up. So they're two organisations that I think are very well equipped to take that step. Toronto, I don't know what's going on with Toronto. They have the players there. They have a lot of top-end talent. Their defence core is non-existent. They don't know how to defend, and that is a coaching issue. The defence coach and Mike Babcock, they have to take responsibility for that. But Kyle Dubas, as I say, has set up the team to be attack-minded and skill-based. There is no sandpaper there. There is no player who can put those big hits in and agitate the opposition and put the opposition off their game and be physical. They don't bully teams, they get bullied. So I would say that the Jets and the Canadians are probably the best set. The Jets have had more recent playoff appearances than the Canadians, although the Canadians have the history and they seem to have the right philosophy right now. But again, it all depends on Carey Price staying fit. The Oilers have had a great start to the season. Can they maintain that? They need some playoff experience. So it's one of those three teams that look best positioned now. But I think long term, I think the Jets possibly long term going forward, I think have the right philosophy in place. But at the end of the day, there's 7 Canadian teams, and at the beginning of every season, all 31 teams honestly do believe they can win a Stanley Cup, because we see with St. Louis how bad they were this time last year, and look what they did. We've seen with the Capitals losing a bit of depth, getting better as a unit because they weren't relying on so many pieces, if you know what I mean. We've seen the fact that Carolina did it 2006 on the smallest budget. So you've got 31 teams. It's a league full of parity, because you look at the teams that are struggling this season that are doing really well last season. Any of the teams can just go on a run. It's such a league full of parity that I think any one of the 31 teams could win it. Who do I think will win this year? You've got to look at the Islanders and the Capitals and the Blues as, for me, the top 3 teams in the league right now. But as we found out last season and the season before, you can have a really good regular season record. So the Nashville Predators 2 years ago, they President's Trophy winners. They were President's Trophy winners by a point over Winnipeg. Second round, they were slaughtered. They were outplayed. They fell apart in the playoffs. It was a 7-game series, but they fell apart in the playoffs. Vegas, division champions, yep, rightly deserved. First-year team, so that shouldn't have happened, but it did. Get to a Stanley Cup final and fell apart, and they had a much better record than Washington. Washington, season before that, President's Trophy winners, fell apart in the playoffs. Toronto, having a really good season, some good points, good solid over 100-point seasons consistently, can't get out the first round. So it's all well and good saying this team on paper is really, really good. And the Blues were a team that choked themselves out the playoffs 2 seasons ago. They were a playoff team and decided to choke it away. And then this time last year, they were nowhere. They were hopeless. Come Christmas, they started to turn it around. First week of January, they were bottom of the league entirely. They were 31st. Went on to win a Stanley Cup. So I don't know. Tampa, President's Trophy winners, record points haul, 60-plus wins, swept in the first round by Columbus. No one predicted St. Louis this time last year as the Stanley Cup winner. No one. They went and did it. Washington regularly struggled, to get out the second round. They never got out the second round. Suddenly they get to their second Stanley Cup final. It took them 20 years to get to their second Stanley Cup final, and they did it. So I think now the league has got more parity in it than before. I think it's anyone's game. There are some teams playing really well right now who haven't been in the playoffs for years, Florida and Arizona. But I think we're too early into the season to be. I think we have a better idea of where teams are at when it comes to trade deadline week. I think that's when you know where teams are going to be at and who's going to be contending. Because last year, Nashville and Winnipeg, just the last bit of the season, Tampa, they just meandered their way to the end of the season, and all of them out in the first round. Calgary out in the first round, Vegas out in the first round. A lot of teams that did really well in the season before, still similar position in their various divisions, took a step back in points, meandered towards the end of the season, and were punished by teams that had driven themselves towards the end. So Columbus, barely squeaking in, wild card, sweeping Tampa. It is what it is. I think now that every team has now had a playoff appearance and has won a playoff round, as an organisation, the parity in the league. So I think until the trade deadline in February, I won't pick a Stanley Cup winning team, because while the Islanders and the Capitals and the Blues are racing away with things at the moment, as they're the top 3 teams in the league, we've seen that teams had good regular season records and fallen apart in the first round. And it happens more regularly than you think, a lot more regularly than you think. Detroit have had many a 100-point plus season and then failed in the first round to get out. And they were a perennial playoff team for 20 or 25 odd seasons. Oh yeah, even after the deadline, there's still teams that can slip out, get in. Florida have almost got in the last couple of seasons. Arizona almost got into the playoffs last season as well. They missed out by a couple of games. So there are some teams that really do play up to the last game to get into the playoffs. Florida for the last 2 seasons have been close. It's come down to the last few games of the season. Same with Arizona last year as well. And those teams have carried on that momentum this year. They've decided to carry on and keep driving forward. Other teams have slipped back. And it is very difficult when you do give up in that first quarter of the season, when you do give up that many games and you give your opposition, your rivals, a head start. It's very hard to get back in. I think the last 16 seasons, teams that are in this position that like Minnesota are in now, only one team has got into a playoff place, and that was Anaheim, I think 4 years ago, in the last 16 seasons or something, or 16 teams to be in this position with a less than 25% win ratio. Only one team's done it, so it's very rare to do it, but at the same time, it's all about the team buying in. In Arizona, the last 2 seasons, they had that record terrible start of winning, I think, 7% of their games at this point in the season. They went on a run in the second half that was actually the 8th best team in the league. So if there had been a lockout shortened season, they would have made the playoffs. And they've carried on that momentum and that growth. They narrowly missed out in the playoffs last season, and now they're second in the Pacific. So they've carried on the growth and momentum. Edmonton have turned things around. It swings and roundabouts. I think it's very difficult to put anything on it. I think it's a 31 team league that's so equal. Any one of the 31 teams on the first puck drop of the season can win the Stanley Cup. Okay, there are a couple of teams that are rebuilding right now that aren't built to contend, but they could still make a playoff run. I think stranger things have happened. St. Louis have proved that you can be down and out on January the 1st, and then within a few months you are Stanley Cup champions. So if St. Louis can prove you can do it and go from last to first, anything is possible. And they just had the confidence going in, and they went on a playoff run, and they went for it. And yeah, they just went on they got the momentum going, and then they just got a momentum of its own. They kept going with it, and they rode that momentum all the way to the Stanley Cup final, which they rightly deserved to win. They were the best team throughout the playoffs. They upset the apple cart when it came to on paper where they finished in the league. They almost actually finished top of the Central. It came literally down to the last day of the season. With the Central Division, they finished third. They could have finished first, and that would have completely changed the outlook of the playoffs, because they would have played Nashville in that sense had things gone the other way, or they would have played Winnipeg anyway. But it would have changed the home ice advantage. It was one of them. It was just a run that they went on. And if they finished first, they could have actually played the wild card. So it could have completely changed the outlook of the playoffs. They might have lost in the first round, but they were basically playing games that mattered for 5 months. Whereas teams like Winnipeg, Nashville, and Tampa were playing. They already locked in their playoff places quite early on, and then they meandered. And you've got to play games that matter. You've got to play with intensity the whole season, otherwise you will get found out. What seed do I think deserves an NHL team? Well, we know Seattle are getting one. There's a big talk about Quebec. Should they get a team back? The Houston ownership group, because there is an NBA team in Houston, they want a team. They've been very open about that. There's been a lot of discussions with the NHL. Atlanta, they've tried twice before. The Thrashers failed for a variety of reasons. The Flames moved to Calgary because it was not working down there. Atlanta is a big city, and it does deserve an NHL team, but they've tried twice, and I don't think the NHL is going to go back a third time. It's just not happening. There's talk about Hamilton, Ontario, to make an 8th Canadian team. There's talk about there's been a lot of talk about certain locations. There are some people who want a team in Hamilton, which is near Toronto, because they believe that there's enough people out in the Toronto metropolitan area who would support a team. There's been, a big debate about should they put a team back in Quebec, bring back the Nordiques. Atlanta, the NHL has been there twice before. It's failed both times. The Thrashers, I think, has really left a really bad taste in the mouth of the NHL. But Atlanta is one of the fastest growing cities in the US. It's a big metropolis in the Deep South. Bettman has been very, very keen on growing the game in non-traditional markets, but at the same time, it hasn't always worked. The fact that they were forced to move the Thrashers to Winnipeg and rename them the Jets. I wouldn't say that hockey isn't popular in Georgia. I just think the way the organizations that have been in Atlanta have been run badly. They've not really been successful when they've been in those locations. For a variety of reasons. The Thrashers, you've got to look at the failure of the Thrashers and why it failed, and the bad ownership and the lack of direction and bad trades, bad drafting. It is what it is, but it's a difficult one. I think Houston is the top on the list. We know that the Houston Rockets owner wants to have an NHL team. He's been having lengthy discussions with the NHL even before Seattle was accepted as the 32nd team. There was meetings. This has been an ongoing saga since before Vegas was announced. That they want a team in Houston. He wanted to relocate the Coyotes. He was turned down to buy that team. They've now got a new owner, and they're going to stay long term in Arizona. They're going to make it work. They've now got stability at that organization. There was talk about moving Carolina. There was talk of the Senators. If you're looking at it, the team that's most likely to be moved, if there's going to be a relocation, which the NHL wants to avoid, that's something they've wanted to avoid a lot recently. The only reason why the Thrashers moved was there was no choice. They had no building to play in because of all the screw ups of that organization. The NHL has shown itself to be very averse to moving teams since the mid-90s. Relocated teams generally struggle to be successful, generally speaking. The Devils and the Flames have won Stanley Cups after being moved, but the NHL is very adverse to moving teams. It prefers expansion. It means you can get more money in. But at the same time, a 32-team league is perfect for fixturing. It's perfect for balance of the conferences and divisions. And when it's... Oh, look, the NHL had plans on the table, and these were just plans. This is not, we're going to do this. It was an idea to have a 10 or 14 team conference over here in Europe, an NHL Europe kind of conference. That's insanity. Yes, they take these regular season and preseason games to Europe on the international European kind of couple of games back-to-back series. That's fine. But the travel, logistics, timings, a whole host of things would mean that not financially viable. You have to look at what the NHL has done. They had this massive... The 80s, it was a 21-team league the entire time. The 90s onwards has been what we call the modern expansion era. The whole decade of the 90s, teams were being added almost on a yearly basis until it hit 30 teams in 2000. It took them 17 years to expand again. A long time. And in that time, there's been 3 lockouts since 1990, 3 of them. 2 of them after 2000. There's been issues with labor unrest. There's been issues with money and who gets what. And the 80s was stable in the sense that there wasn't much expansion. The 90s to 2000, 9 new teams joined the league in 10 years. So there was almost a team a year at one point being added to the league. Then they stopped for 17 years. and then Vegas came along, and now we've got Seattle coming in 2021. So in 2 years' time, we have another team joining the league, and it makes it 32. I can't see the NHL going past 32 teams. I can't. I know that there could be a possibility that happens, but the fact that the franchises that were very likely to be moved if they were going to continue to struggle financially have all now got new ownership and a new direction means it's highly unlikely that a team is relocated to Houston. It means Quebec is pushed further down the list for any new team. It's an interesting one. Could I imagine the NHL going to Mexico? No, I can't. I can't see that being sustainable financially or working, especially with the current political climate. And that's something you have to bear in mind: is the current politics and policies of the US government, which are not wholly favourable to Latin America, if you think about it. And I don't think ice hockey is popular in Canada somehow. I think it's an interesting one. People say Atlanta should have a team again because it's a big metropolitan area. It's had a team twice. It has failed twice for different reasons. I wouldn't say it's because fans didn't care. Fans cared. Fans watched games there. There was really piss poor management, a lack of direction, a lack of, it just wasn't well run. And I think that's left a really bad taste in the NHL's mouth. And I think, yes, Gary Bettman has been very, very keen on taking hockey to non-traditional markets in the US especially. And the Canadian fans have been disgruntled by this. But the issue is this: it's economics. The Canadian dollar isn't as strong as the US dollar at the moment. The Canadian economy isn't as strong as it could be at the moment. And that does have an impact on where you can put a team. And a lot of Canadian cities aren't very big. And that means TV revenues and getting, the corporate dollar. The only place you could really have a team outside of Quebec is Hamilton. And could that work? Could Wembley host games? You got Wembley Arena, you got the O2, and there's been talk about the KHL wanting to have a team in London. If the Elite League doesn't have a team in London, and the last fully top flight professional team in London didn't really have an arena that could meet safety standards all those years ago in the Super League, there you go. I don't know where you would have a team in London. The KHL has been talk about that. Could Wembley host the games when the NHL brings pre-season? Yes and no, but when the pre-season takes place, it's too warm. It's September, when it's the NHL pre-season. There are some arenas like Nottingham and Sheffield and Belfast and that have hosted big events. And Belfast has had the Boston Bruins play a pre-season game against the Belfast Giants a few years back. So the NHL has been to the UK. The Bracknell Bees, since I've moved, I'm not as close. I've moved like 8 miles up the road, but I'm not as close to the arena or the Bracknell as I was. I don't have a lot of money right now. I'm in a bit of the move has been more expensive than anticipated. I've got to pay the 700 quid in council tax, which I was not expecting. So financially, I'm not in a position to go to as many games as I would like. The team is having a up and down season. There's been some good results and some bad results. Inconsistent is the term there, but I think the Elite League would like to expand. And I was asked earlier about will more British players get drafted by the NHL. I honestly believe that will happen, as long as the GB national side stays in the World Championship top tier. There is obviously Canada are going to be playing GB before the World Championships in the spring, so that's going to be interesting. The Elite League has definitely had a positive impact. It's definitely a well-supported league in the size that crowds are pretty decent. The Bracknell organisation now has a third team because there's been that much interest from new fans, people wanting to play the game, more kids playing the game. So yes, I've definitely seen an uptake in kids playing the game, and growth of the game at youth level. So there's now enough youth players playing to warrant having a third team and growing the game. So yes, I think the sport is growing in the UK. And the question was asked earlier, would there be a more, as I say, British players drafted. And I think, yes, I think we are going to get to the point where we could have more British players of a good enough quality to play in North America and be drafted by the NHL. Absolutely. I think the quality level of British ice hockey has improved massively in my lifetime. And yes, I do think it's very, very likely that within the next 5 years, more British players are drafted. If we can get multiple British players in the draft, that I think also would help grow the game as well. If we can get more than one player in a draft year getting drafted, it doesn't matter if what round they get drafted in, but I think that would definitely improve uh, the direction of the sport in this country and the growth of the sport in this country. But we'll see what happens. I mean, at the moment, the focus should be on sustaining the sport right now and growing the sport right now. And yeah, hopefully the GB national side can qualify for Tokyo, the Tokyo Winter Olympics. I think that's the next goal is to do that. The issue is the NHL at the moment. The Tokyo Summer Olympics is Beijing, which is the next Winter Olympics. Tokyo is the Summer Olympics, but yes, the NHL right now does not allow its players to play at the Olympics. That is a big debate that's being had by the NHLPA and the NHL to do with allowing the players to play at the Olympics. They obviously didn't go to the last Olympics in Pyeongchang, which was a shame. A lot of hockey fans would like to see the best players go, but there are those hockey fans that would rather see their teams in the NHL be able to put out the strongest rosters possible and compete for a Stanley Cup. A lot of the players did voice their disappointment with not being allowed to play at the Olympics last year. A lot of players. It is what it is. It will affect obviously scheduling of games because you have to. The NHL teams would have to allow their players to go to the Olympics, which means they lose their best players for like a month, which gives the opportunity for younger players to step up and to get that experience at the NHL level. But it's a debate for the NHLPA and the NHL to have in the collective bargaining agreement discussions that are still ongoing. We know that a lockout looks very likely to have been avoided, and it looks like there's a lot of positivity going into those discussions because, as I say, in my lifetime, there's been 3 lockouts. There's been a player strike, and this is something that has dogged the NHL since the mid '90s. Is the unrest between the players and the league, and it has damaged the fact that in the US there isn't a TV deal in place. It does affect trying to grow the game in the US. There's also falling ratings in Canada, and less kids are playing the game now, percentage-wise, than what they were 10 years ago. There's been a drop-off in youth participation, which is a problem and ongoing concern. So while the NHL as a product is making as much money as possible, it's never made us. It's making more money every year, and the players are getting paid better every year. There are still lots of concerns at play in that sense. But hopefully, yes, we can have a good, strong British squad for the Olympics coming up in a couple of years. And yeah, having a domestic TV deal that highlights, the British game and when British teams are playing is really good. And also, they got a good TV deal for the SHL, so the Swedish league. They show NHL games, so there is clearly an interest here in the UK. I don't know why the Asian, like Tokyo, have got the Summer Olympics coming up. Beijing have got the Winter Olympics coming up. I think they're the only nations that seem to have the disposable income and the infrastructure in place to do it. I think, I know it's off NHL topic, but I do think they seem to be the only countries willing to take the risk of hosting those big Olympic tournaments and Olympic competitions. Honestly, I think the growth in Asia when it comes to infrastructure development and growth of cities, and where the corporate money goes is clearly a thing. It's the direction that I think international sport's going to take more and more. I think it is what it is. You look at, I think Tokyo has had the Olympics twice. It will have it a second time, obviously, when next summer. Uh, you've had Nagano Winter Olympics. So Japan's had the Olympics three times, both winter and summer. Korea has had the Olympics twice. China's going to have the Olympics twice. Beijing's going to be the first city to host the summer and winter games. They've got the money. They have the money in which to host these big events. They have the infrastructure in place and the organisation in place, and they have the willingness to do it. I The Football World Cup has been hosted by Japan in 2002, co-hosted with Korea. So Japan's just had the Rugby World Cup. So Japan and Korea hosted the Football World Cup in 2002. So yeah, that part of Asia is getting a lot of these big sporting events. It is. I mean, the Seoul Olympics was a year before I was born, but we've had Nagano in '98. We've had Beijing in 2008. We've got Tokyo next year. We've had Pyeongchang in 2018. So they're regularly going back to these locations. They're regularly, in 2022 we've got the Beijing Winter Olympics. So they are clearly invested. The International Olympic Committee is clearly invested in these locations. They believe that this is the direction they want to take going forward. But the cost of organising the Olympics is ruinous for some cities. The host city. We've seen how much it cost London. We've seen how much Athens. And look at the facilities that aren't being used. Rio, that the cost is ruinous, and not all the facilities get used post Olympics. Rio and Athens are two prime examples of where the Olympic legacy, it hasn't really been a legacy. The venues have been left to rot. Sarajevo in '84 in Bosnia, which was former Yugoslavia, most of the venues there have been left to completely fall to pieces and rot. Yes, there was civil conflict, there was conflict and war, but the cost of hosting Olympics and maintaining the facilities, ruinous, absolutely ruinous. And Salt Lake City. I mean, this is why I'm surprised the NHL hasn't gone to Utah. They put a lot of money into Salt Lake, and the NHL has not been back to Utah at all. So it is what it is. I mean, Montreal had a Winter Olympics that nearly didn't, or Summer Olympics that nearly didn't take place because of strikes. The cost of putting on an Olympic Games is almost ruinous. It takes years of preparation and infrastructure. Calgary had the Winter Olympics in '88, and the Saddle Dome was already a building that was being used by the Flames. It desperately needs replacing or refurbishment. That's been an ongoing issue for the Calgary Flames. Is their arena? It's falling. It's the second oldest arena in the league, and it's falling apart. The Saddle Dome is crumbling. So yeah, there is that kind of maintenance of the infrastructure post Olympics, and Calgary was tempted to bid for the Winter Olympics again, in order to get a refurbed arena, and the costs would have been ruinous, absolutely ruinous. The Chinese government and heavily funds its Olympic sports program on an industrial scale. That's a well-known fact. The Chinese Communist Party has spent billions and billions and billions of dollars in sports programs in the build-up to the Beijing Olympics in 2008, and now they've got this Winter Olympics as well. They've really put a lot of money into the sports programs, and hence why they get so many medals. They've turned it into an industry out there of production line of sporting talent. And I know we're going well off NHL, but the NHL has played preseason games in China. The KHL has a team in Beijing. There is an interest of the NHL selling its product to China. And whether you agree with that direction the NHL is taking, they're trying to make as much revenue as possible, and they have taken preseason games to China. You say that, but you've got to have the interest from the participants, and you've got to have interest from fans. Now, the Chinese, the KHL team, there's hardly any Chinese players on it, and the fan base just isn't there. The KHL has just gone there to make money. The team isn't very good. The NHL have taken preseason games there, and they have been criticised by some for doing so. That uh, I, I, it is what it is. Because the Chinese obviously have the Winter Olympics coming up, they want to improve their hockey team because they have to qualify for the Winter Olympics. They have to put a team on the ice. That's why they're doing it. That's why they allowed the KHL to put a team in China. That's why they're allowing the NHL to take preseason games there. But it'll be interesting to see how bad the Chinese ice hockey team is in a couple of years. We saw how bad the Korean teams were at the Winter Olympics last year. They were, well, not on the same page as the European teams and the North American, Canadian, and US teams. They weren't on the same page. It was embarrassing. Absolutely embarrassing how outplayed they were and how just out of their depth they were. And I think that's going to be an issue going forward. But the fact that the NHL is continuing to want to take preseason games to China and sell the product to China is it's reality. It is a reality, and the Chinese are more than happy to absorb the product because they want to get people ready for the Winter Olympics when there is going to be ice hockey at the Winter Olympics. The fact that the NHL, there's still discussions about could they possibly let the players go to the Winter Olympics. There is social media in China, but it's heavily state controlled. Heavily state controlled. They have their own state-run social media companies. China is a weird place. I've got friends who go out over there for work. It's a very strange country in the sense that it is communist, but it's also capitalist at the same time. If you look at all the businesses, you've got like Samsung billboards, you've got billboards for Mercedes. They all, they love their Aston Martins, they love their designer clothes. But the central government is strict on certain parts of daily life, heavy media censorship, really draconian laws. But yeah, it's a communist country in politics, capitalist in economy, basically. In a sense, it's a weird country in that sense. I like the way we've gone off the NHL into Chinese economic and political policies. But no, the NHL, they are really trying to drive that to the Chinese public to get them used to watching ice hockey. And they've allowed the KHL to put a team there in Beijing. And they are trying to push ice hockey to the people because it's part of the Winter Olympics. And it's a great way for the NHL to make money because they're selling their product to the biggest market in the world. And you were asking about what city deserves a team. There's a whole host of cities that have put in bids and have arenas ready and want to have a team. Kansas City is another one that's had a team in the past. You could say you could have a team back in Hartford, the original Whalers, which is now the Carolina Hurricanes. You could put a team there. You could say, yes, Atlanta, Houston. You could say you could have another team in California, San Diego, for example. You could have a team in Portland, in Oregon, but you've got Seattle coming in. There's a whole host of things. Oh yeah, the Houston Rockets. Well, the guy who owns the Houston Rockets wants to have an NHL team, and he's been very critical of the NBA going to China. Very critical, but he wants to have an NHL team, and the NHL has gone to China to play preseason games. So that's interesting. That this could be a sticking point for him. He wants to have this NHL team. He's got the arena there. He has the arena. He has the money. He's ready to go, and the NHL went with Seattle, and he's still wanting a team. He's been very clear in the statements he's released, saying, "I want to have an NHL team by expansion or relocation in this city." And it seems now that all the teams that were struggling with ownership or direction, Arizona, Carolina, and I think Ottawa's probably the most likely to be relocated. Florida got a long-term lease on their arena. Arizona just got new ownership and look very likely to sort out their arena issues. And the new owner said, "I'm staying in Arizona." Ottawa is the only team that, in theory, could be moved, but then it unbalances the conferences. So the Houston Rockets owners, being very critical of the Chinese Chinese government hasn't helped his cause in getting an NHL team because the NHL is taking preseason games to China on a regular basis. How many Europeans do you think will be in the NHL draft compared to Americans and Canadians? You look at the percentages of players that play in the NHL and national origin. It's about 40%. I think it's between 30 and 40% now. So the Canadians and the Americans still dominate the NHL draft, and will do for a while yet. And we've seen a massive growth of the sport in the US. They've got a great youth program, and more kids are playing in the US outside of the traditional US areas, which are generally in the northeast and along the Canadian border area. There's a lot more kids playing the game in non-traditional locations. There's been more rinks built. But the problem is it's a very expensive sport to get into. And this is something that the NHL, all this money that's coming into the league, could give something back in growing the game and assisting those from lesser backgrounds to play the game. That's a debate that's been often had over recent years, is the cost and how expensive it is, and what can be done to mitigate that cost and make it easier to access the sport. But the Canadians and the Americans still dominate the percentages when it comes to players playing in the NHL. They still dominate the percentages when it comes to players being drafted by the NHL. But I can see the Europeans, as time goes on, as Seattle joins, that means you've got to find more players, which for me, it's going to be interesting when Seattle does join the expansion draft and then the actual entry draft as well, how that is affected. Will more Europeans get in the draft? And I've been asked the question, is there going to be more British players drafted? Absolutely. I can't see how that wouldn't happen with the growth the sport has seen in this country in recent years, and Liam Kirk helping, and the national side as a whole doing really well and being successful. I can't see how that wouldn't happen. We'll have to wait and see, come draft week in the summer next year, the actual percentages, and then looking at future draft prospects, because it's also a cultural thing. The Germans have a solid league. The French have, I think, 4 or 5 players playing in the NHL at the moment. The UK, yet Liam Kirk's been drafted. We are a little step behind. Italy, I think 1 or 2 have played in the NHL at some point. But at the same time, you've got to look at the most popular sports in those countries, and it's not ice hockey. Germany, football. The UK, football. France, football. Italy, football. Rugby union is a secondary in Italy, France, and the UK when it comes to team sports, because you can play that nationwide, whereas ice hockey, it's a winter sport, and certain locations, it doesn't snow. It's not really a wintry kind of location. But Germany has a very strong national league. Italy, they play in the Alpine League and the Italian League, so they give teams to several leagues. The UK and France have pretty solid domestic leagues as well. The quality level will improve. It's that first player getting drafted, that first superstar player who does well in the NHL, can encourage others to play. The national sides as well, being more successful, will also encourage others to play. Germany have got a silver medal at the Olympics last year. The UK has rapidly gone up the world rankings. Italy have improved massively as well. The French, not so much. The French have taken a backward step. So it's going to be interesting. It does actually matter about the temperature outside, because that affects how the ice surface behaves. The warmer it is outside, the more energy has to be used to keep the ice cool, and that is a massive cost. It's not a very environmentally friendly sport to play necessarily when it comes to keeping the ice cool. You do find if you do have an early spring heat wave or a late summer, autumn heat wave when the season starts or season's nearly over, it can actually affect the ice surface. We have seen that effect being seen in the NHL as well. It sort of mists up. It sort of gets a little bit of fog going, and it does affect how the ice behaves and how the puck behaves. You'll be surprised they play it in Argentina. They do play ice hockey in Mexico. They have a team in Dubai. I used to work with a woman whose dad used to play ice hockey in Iraq before Saddam Hussein came to power. So it is played around the world. It's just at a much lower level. Um, but it's not really a warm climate sport. Really, it's not really well followed in these warm climate countries because they just don't know what snow is. It's a thing. It's a cultural thing. Um, but absolutely, the sport could definitely grow and be more out there. And I think this is where the NHL can put some of the money in. The biggest league in the world, best players in the world. It does take the best players out of Europe. It needs to give something back. And this is where I think they can help grow the sport in Europe and continue to keep the quality level coming. Yes, the Scandinavians are predominantly where the Scandinavians and the former Soviet bloc countries like Russia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, yeah, they do produce a lot of NHL quality players. But the Scandinavians, they started the European invasion. The former communist countries followed that up with the second wave, as they call it. And now that the Western and Central European countries and Northern European countries are starting to drip feed them in, like the Danes and the Germans, the Brits, the French, it will pick up a momentum of its own because that one player getting drafted, those few players getting drafted, inspires the next batch to go, I want to be just as good as that guy. So it does sort of trickle down. I can see more Western and Northern European players going that aren't Scandinavian going. I can. But at the same time, it has to be done sustainably, and we can't take our best talent out and denude and weaken the domestic leagues that produce them. The NHL does need to sort of give something back in a sense and help develop the sport. But I'm going to leave that there. I've sort of gone a bit off topic towards the end. I wanted to discuss individual teams that are struggling. We looked at Toronto, we looked at Minnesota, we looked at LA. San Jose is another one. That sort of struggled this season, although we started to pick it up. Tampa are not performing very well. So I'm going to finish on this. I'm going to finish on the Maple Leafs because we started on the Maple Leafs. The Canadian media is heavily based in Toronto. It's very Toronto-centric. This is why I started on the Maple Leafs. The issues that team has can be mirrored by multiple teams in the league. The issues with the Maple Leafs, however, is on paper, they have a really terrifying attack. In practice, they have no defense. If the Maple Leafs are to solve their issues, they're going to have to do some trades. They're going to have to fix it by the trade or waiver wire. They need to pick up a defensive defenseman. They need to pick up a veteran defenseman as well. And Tyson Barrie could be on the way out, and could Mike Babcock be on the way out. So if you follow the NHL, follow what's happening at the Maple Leafs, that is mirrored in lots of other organisations within the NHL, but the Maple Leafs, because of the media interest and the fan base interest and the intensity and the pressure on that team, that's something you want to look out for. But for now, thank you very much for watching. I know we went a bit off topic, but there were a lot of interesting questions being raised. And yes, what city deserves an NHL team? Houston gets mentioned a lot, Quebec, Hamilton, but Seattle's the next team. We've got to see what happens with the expansion draft and how they put that team together and how competitive that team is out the gate, considering the success of Vegas. And will the NHL go past 32 teams? There we go. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe. Place your comments below, and I'll have some more videos for you very, very soon.